master's program, and it's just this way.
Hindsight.
That's how people usually figure out where they see
Some of the seminars,
Sometimes
or the adults
PhD
want
say,
to
okay, write up.
that's
Well, the real fun story about the trail is the reason it was partially done.
Yeah, I know.
Because my technician thought she was going
Obviously, it's like a spaceship. You don't, none of those buttons mean anything during the talk. It's best if you don't even see it.
So she bushwhacked
Yeah,
the
we did
trail
one.
that
It's like
was
a lab sample.
twice the length,
It's like, oh sure.
all the way back, like, it went to the
thinking
trough,
that it was
an
gonna be
inch,
like, okay, our lab will get a brief
but it
talk,
was
and
like
then
a,
lab will. But it's
I've never
like,
seen
yeah,
one of those.
three labs.
yeah, and she was like, yeah,
So we're standing up, and I've done all the seminar stuff. I'm like, I know this is getting recorded.
not any kind of
And like, I had just gotten results back. I was like, yeah, go for it.
fine, we can work this out.
Discussion is like, he's like, wait a minute, it's a learning experience.
He's only 3/4 of the
No matter
way
what,
up the road. She's like, no, I'm
Well,
not.
it's not that it's out. That's perfect. I'm sure.
And then we actually started looking at the map and we're like,
They're actually kind of banned. Oh,
she was like, and she also, she was very determined. She crossed down the road. Yeah. I know, I was like, and well, I could say she crossed the river. She crossed the river 3 times. Oh,
Yeah, that just sums up feeling we're not there. Hey, just trust. No, not at all. Very lost.
Build exactly.
My advisor's like senior. I was telling you a story. No.
I'm doing just like one experiment. I mean, that's the nice thing. Like, I stated in my life this time last
I
year.
tried to bring it
Scouting.
Like I read about it,
Getting together.
It's like, you know what quadernite is?
Yeah.
And so, you know where I'm going?
No, I
You look at
On
them.
forest, on the road. And so I'm like, I hear you.
This is just going in the summer.
They don't need it.
You must be also relieved.
I am, yes. I was just Nashville. But you get back. Yes, and she gave her the excited, she wants to heal, so she's excited and she said Trump was her favorite. Oh, yeah. Yes, and she really wants to do it too. She's like, like animal, not animal clothes, like animal skin, like tons of little animals. Yeah.
Anything that she wants to cover, like, related to
Oh, okay.
I mean, I checked about that and what I might be able to help her with, or
I'm normally halfway
My dog was, well, actually, I don't know if she was.
Why do you laugh?
So, adding on to the motion, when I found out how to play, I know, I was thinking about it.
Dr. Adam Rosenblatt. Adam's an assistant professor of coastal ecology at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville, one of the largest cities geographically in the U.S. So anyway, Adam is originally from the city of our most recent Super Bowl champions, Philadelphia. Woo! Yeah. So he started at Oberlin College, where he earned his BS in biology and actually double majored in history, where he then moved south to Florida International University in Miami, where he completed his PhD in alligator trophic ecology and individual specialization in the Everglades. So, and really enhanced and raised the bar, I think, on our understanding of alligator behavior and provide a mechanistic understanding of a lot of what we see today. And after that, he followed that up with a postdoc at Yale in the lab with Dr. Oswald Schmitz, where he studied food web dynamics and climate change. And after 3 years at Yale, he followed that up with a fellowship in science and technology in the Department of Energy through the American Association of the Advancement of Science. So, and after a year in Washington, D.C., he was then able to start his recent job at the University of North Florida. And so, though he recently started this fall, Adam's starting up a productive research program in climate change in relation to coastal ecosystems and species, where he's continuing his alligator work. In the crocodilian world, Adam's a prolific researcher and collaborator. He's worked in black caimans in Guyana as a member of the Crocodile Specialist Group, and also is fairly active on Twitter. You should definitely give him a follow as well. So, without further ado, Adam, take it away.
Wow, that's the most thorough and generous introduction I've ever got. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Abby. It's great to be here at Clemson, my first time. I hope you don't hold it against me that my wife did her master's at University of South Carolina. It doesn't color my, impression of Clemson. It's a beautiful place. But yeah, so I want to talk to you today about climate change, why we need to make climate change ecology a little bit more of a realistic science. Before that, I just want to acknowledge the folks who funded all this work. I'm going to be talking about some work I did during my PhD at FIU that was funded through the Florida Coastal Everglades Long-Term Ecological Research Program. Fantastic program, 150 scientists all trying to understand what's going on in the coastal Everglades. That, of course, is funded through NSF. And and the lovely people at Everglades National Park who made that research possible as well. And then I'll be talking about some postdoc work that I did at Yale. It was funded by Yale Climate and Energy Institute and Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Took place at another beautiful location, Yale Myers Forest in northeast Connecticut. Also, as you all know, just want to call attention to the fact that none of this work is possible on my lonesome. This is just a small sampling, actually, of the large number of people who assist with the research I've done over the years. This is 52 people who helped me catch alligators during my PhD. And so clearly wouldn't have been able to do all the stuff I've done without all these people pitching in. And three main people who have pitched in, my advisor at FIU for my PhD, Mike Heithaus, and then, as Abby was saying, Oz Schmitz at Yale, who's my postdoc advisor. And I'm also going to talk about some of the work I did in collaboration with Lauren Smith Ramesh. She was a postdoc at Yale at the same time that I was. She's currently at the National Institute for Mathematical and Biological Synthesis. So these three folks have really informed the work that I'm going to talk about today. So let's get back to the title. Climate change is real. Why is climate change ecology unrealistic? I'm not going to belabor the point about climate change and what's going on. I'm sure you're all familiar at least a basic level with what's happening. I'm not going to show any temperature graphs or hockey sticks or anything like that. I'm just going to assume we're all operating from a common baseline understanding. But what I do want to emphasize is that we, as environmental scientists, are going to be the ones who are called upon to make, accurate predictions about what's going to happen in the face of climate change when it comes to flora and fauna and ecosystems in general. And you would think that to make those kinds of accurate predictions, we would be doing realistic sort of experiments and models to try to simulate what's going to happen in the future. But as I'm going to show you, I don't think we're really doing those experiments and models, at least at the level that we need to be doing them at to make these predictions that we're going to be called on to make. So why is climate change ecology unrealistic? Here's a quick primer. One is that ecology can be really complicated, as I'm sure you all know, right? All you need to do is take a look at a food web, any kind of realistic food web, to understand that it's really difficult to understand what's going on with dozens, potentially hundreds, potentially thousands of species all interacting at various levels, indirectly, directly. It's a very complicated thing to think about. And so what we tend to do is we tend to, simplify these ecological systems so that we can better understand them. So we have ecology being really complicated in the first place. Then we have climate change being really complicated. And to understand the complexity of climate change, all you have to do is look at how climate models are structured, right? This is sort of a visual representation of what modern climate models look like, or as they call them now, Earth system models. And you have just an amazing array of interacting variables, ocean dynamics, land dynamics, solar dynamics, cloud dynamics, atmospheric dynamics, biosphere dynamics. I mean, it's just, the list goes on and on. You can only run these models on the biggest, most powerful supercomputers in the world because it's so complex, all of the factors that are going into this, right? And when you think about, that's just to make predictions about what's going to happen, but when you think about all the different variables that are affected by climate change, it's also a very intense list, right? We're going to have simultaneous shifts in temperature, precipitation, carbon dioxide, or pH and acidity if you're in an aquatic environment. Wind is shifting, ozone levels are shifting, ultraviolet radiation is shifting, all because of climate change. And I would venture to say that there is not a single ecosystem on Earth that's going to be affected by just one of these variables, right? Basically, everywhere is going to at least be affected by increases in temperature and changes in carbon dioxide or pH. And then to varying degrees, depending on where you are, it will be affected by changes in precipitation, wind, ozone, and UV. And so what I'm kind of advocating for is we need to embrace this complexity, right? If we're going to have multivariable climate change going on all over the world, we can't be looking at unrealistic scenarios. So, as I've already said, just to reiterate, ecology can be really complicated, climate change can be really complicated, and so what we do in the face of that complexity is we simplify, right? And I'm not faulting anybody for this. This is the natural thing that we do as scientists when we're presented with a really complex scenario. You have to kind of make it tangible, right? You have to break it down into its component parts and figure out what really matters. You can't focus on every species, you can't focus on every climate variable. But I think that we have sort of defaulted to a system where we're working at a level that's a little bit too simplistic, and we need to push to be a little bit more complex. So I actually wanted to quantify this. So I did a meta-analysis back in 2014 with my postdoc advisor that was trying to figure out, well, how simplistic really are we being when we're doing these kinds of studies? And the results were we did a bunch of searches, Web of Science, Google Scholar, all the normal things to find all of the studies that fit into sort of the climate change and trophic ecology sphere of influence, and came up with about 2,100 studies that fit our search criteria. And if you actually went through those 2,100 studies, only 328 of them, or about 15.5%, looked at one climate variable and its effects on at least two trophic levels, right? So, predator and prey, or plant and herbivore, or whatever. So that means that about 85% of the studies that had been done, and this was 2014, so I'm sure these numbers have changed a little bit, but in 2014, about 85% of the studies that had been done in this space had looked at one climate variable and one trophic level, and most frequently they were looking at one species within that trophic level. They weren't looking at multiple competing species, right? So we're taking the complexity out of the climate change dynamics by just looking at one variable at a time, and we're also taking the complexity out of the ecology side by looking at one species or one trophic level at a time, when we know that in nature that's not how it works, right? You have a community context where all of these different things are interacting with each other simultaneously. If you move on, so only 41 of the studies, about 1.9%, looked at least two climate variables and more than two trophic levels. And then only 6 studies, 0.3%, looked at 3 climate variables and more than 2 trophic levels, and how those 3 climate variables interacted to affect the feeding interactions that were going on. And in addition to being another troubling thing that we learned in this, is that only 5 studies lasted more than 100 days. Right? So we're having very short-term studies, even though we know climate change is a long-term phenomenon that's going to continue affecting things for decades and centuries and potentially millennia. And so, this is all just showing that simplicity's sort of been the default for the moment, but I think we need to amp things up a little bit. The reason is because when you start combining these climate variables, you can get some very unexpected outcomes. So there's a graph from that same paper looking at just pairwise interactions between various climate variables, carbon dioxide across a temperature, rainfall across a temperature, and so on and so forth. And the different bars indicate different interaction types, right? So in these studies, they would measure the effect of carbon dioxide by itself on a certain, predator-prey relationship. Then they'd measure the effect of temperature by itself on a predator-prey relationship. Then they would look at, if you do them both at the same time, what's the outcome? Does it change the direction and the magnitude of the effects of both in isolation? The black bars indicate antagonistic interactions, which means that the product of both carbon dioxide and temperature together caused an effect that was lower, that was actually the opposite direction than either variable by itself. The white bars indicate multiplicative interactions, which is sort of the default. It's like what you would expect to happen if you combine 2 things that each have an effect. You would expect the overall additive, multiplicative effect to be larger than either in isolation. And then the smallest bar are the synergistic effects, where the effect of both variables coming together at the same time is even larger than you would expect, just based on the multiplicative model. And the reason I show this is just to show that for a bunch of these combinations, up to between 30 and 40% of the time, you're getting antagonistic interactions, right? So that's suggesting that if you have one variable and it increases some some metric of feeding relationships, and then you have the second variable, and it also increases the same metric of feeding relationships. When you put them together, they actually decrease that metric, right? They're having the opposite effect. And this happens very frequently. Like, it happens almost half the time for a number of these combinations. And so if we're not looking at these interactions, and you just look at the either variable in isolation, you would make erroneous predictions, right? So, moving away from this default simplification, where people are either looking at usually plants by themselves, or they're looking at herbivore-plant relationships, and just basically raising the temperature, right? That's kind of the default of what people have done in this space. What I'm advocating for is moving towards a more realistic scenario. This was from another paper I wrote with Schmitz. It was developing a conceptual model of what realistic effects of climate change on food webs look like. And of course, I don't want you to read any of this. I just want you to look and be, in awe of the complexity. These are all the ways, direct and indirect, that temperature, water availability, and carbon dioxide can affect what's going on in the food web. You can have direct effects on the plants, you can have direct effects on the herbivores, direct effects on the predators, indirect effects within the food web. The climate variables themselves can vary each other. I mean, they can change the effect, right? If you increase carbon dioxide, it changes the way that plants respond to, drought. So there's very complex things going on. that I think we should be focusing on more. So what I want to do to illustrate this, I want to take you through 3 case studies from the research I've done. The first one is about old field community responses to warming and drought in combination. That was the work I did in Connecticut. The second is modeling shifts in community size structure in a multivariable climate change scenario. And then the last one, going back to the alligators, is alligators responding to sea level rise in the Everglades. And each of these case studies will illustrate how, if you don't take complexity into account when you're thinking about how climate change is going to affect things, it can lead to erroneous predictions. So let's go through this first one. The first one took place in northeastern Connecticut at a forest that's owned by Yale University, an 8,000-acre forest that's a teaching forest and a sustainable logging forest that the forestry school uses to educate their students. And I was working in this food web here. That's my advisor, Oz Schmitz. He's been working in this food web for like 20 years, and they know an amazing amount about this food web. There's a predator at the top, the nursery web spider, which feeds on the generalist herbivore, this red-legged grasshopper. And then the herbivore primarily feeds on 2 different plants. It feeds on a protein-rich grass group, and then it feeds on a more carbohydrate-rich solidago or goldenrod plant. And this is what our experiments look like in the field. We put these cages out over natural vegetation. You make an enclosure, and then you stock these cages with natural field densities of spiders and grasshoppers, and then you manipulate the cages to see, or you manipulate the food web itself to see what the effects might be. So there was previous work in this lab before I got to it that looked at the effect of warming by itself on grasshopper fitness. And what you do is you take our standard mesocosm field cages and you basically wrap them in plastic. You create a passive warming effect, right? You're putting a sort of a layer on top of the cage, stopping air from moving through as much and sort of trapping more of that heat inside. And what he found, this is Brandon Barton's work during his PhD before I got to Yale. What he found was that it increases grasshopper fitness if you warm this scenario. So I want you to pay attention to this graph right here. I'll explain this fitness index later, but the fitness index is related to the reproductive capacity of the female grasshoppers in this system. And so what he found is that if you have an ambient temperature, right, and this is with predators in there, so the spiders are in these cages. If you have an ambient temperature, the grasshoppers have a certain metric of reproductive fitness, and if you increase the temperature, their fitness goes up. They have enhanced reproductive fitness. The reason he found was that if you heat up these environments, the spiders respond more strongly to the temperature than the grasshoppers do. The spiders actually move lower in the canopy towards the ground to avoid the hot air that's rising off the ground, and then the grasshoppers are released from that predation risk, and they're able to spend more time feeding, right? So they're able to gather more resources. Presumably those resources are going towards their own egg production. But so I wanted to ask the question, well, what if we look at a multivariable scenario, right? Warming is not the only thing that's going to happen. You could have instances in the future in this system in Connecticut where there could be prolonged droughts. And what happens if you pair a warming condition with a drought condition? So I did Brandon's experiment again with an added piece where we had an ambient treatment, we had a warm treatment, we had a drought treatment, and then we had the warm crossed with the drought treatment, right? And the drought treatment was from these rain shelters where I just, wrapped the cages in plastic if they were part of the warm treatment, and then constructed a rain shelter to block most of the rainfall from hitting these cages over a 3-month period during the summer growing season for these grasshoppers. And the question was, instead of just what are the effects on the grasshoppers, what are the effects on survival and fitness across all 3 trophic levels, the plants, the grasshoppers, the spiders all together, what's happening? What we found is that if you look at the goldenrod, where you can easily quantify survival and sexual reproduction, you find that, if it's ambient, 100% of the plants survive the entire season. You get a slight decrease when you get to a warmed environment, but not significant. Slight decrease in a drought environment, and then you finally get a significant decrease in survival when you cross warming with drought. But this isn't really that surprising, right? Because you see the survival decreases a little bit in a warmed environment, it decreases a little bit in a drought environment, and it decreases even more in a warm by drought environment. That would be an example of that multiplicative effect I was talking about, right? The warm by drought effect is still going in the same direction as both the warm and the drought effects by themselves. See the same thing if it comes to sexual reproduction, which was quantified as the percent of plants that were able to actually produce flowers by the end of the season. And you can see again in the ambient treatment, we have a very high percentage, 80% of plants that are able to produce flowers. You get a decrease in warming, you get a decrease in a drought treatment, and you get an even bigger decrease in a warm by drought treatment, right? So we see that crossing these two variables together is having a bigger impact on the system, but it's a fairly predictable impact, right? This isn't really that surprising. But if you move on to another trophic level, you can get some surprising interactions. Looking at the main thing I was interested in, which was the female grasshopper reproduction, which was the thing that Brandon had quantified when he did the warming by itself. So just a little introduction to female grasshopper reproduction. This is what grasshopper ovaries look like. They're paired ovaries with these nice football-shaped sort of ovarials here that produce the eggs. And if you zoom in, if you look at them under a dissecting microscope, you can see these little orange blobs that are at the base of some of the ovarials. Those orange blobs indicate instances when the grasshopper basically resorbed an egg back into herself before laying it, right? So she was saving those nutrients for herself, resorbing them back in instead of putting those nutrients back into the environment through her eggs. So this is an indicator of stress, right? It's an indicator that if you're in a low food environment or if you're in a stressful temperature environment or a stressful dehydration environment, then the females are more likely to resorb those nutrients from the eggs back into their body and save them for themselves. So what I found was a big difference in what Brandon found. So I found the same thing that Brandon found where, I have to qualify here. This metric is these failed eggs basically are called ORBs, oocyte resorption bodies. And so the metric is the ratio of ORBs to the total number of ovarials. So this is the same metric that Brandon used, but his metric was the inverse. So in his metric, if the numbers go up, you have increased fitness, but in my metric, if the numbers go down, you have increased fitness, okay? And there's a reason for that. I won't get into it, but if you have questions, we can talk about it later. So what I found was that a warm treatment increased, right? The numbers go down, so that's an increase in grasshopper fitness in a warm treatment, though not significant. Again, you get a slight increase in a drought environment. The fitness goes up a little bit, but then you have the exact opposite response in a warm by drought environment, right? You would not be able to predict this response just from either of these in isolation. The interaction somehow stresses out the grasshoppers so much that they greatly decrease their reproductive output rather than slightly increasing their reproductive output. And then, just to explain a little bit of the mechanism here, what I think was going on is I also measured how the availability of nitrogen to this food web changed in these warm by drought treatments. And I did this with these ionic exchange membranes that sort of mimic plant roots. You stick them in the soil, and then they absorb nitrogen onto them over a period of time, and you can quantify like what the rate is of nitrogen uptake of these plant roots. And so this is the change in nitrogen uptake rates between the beginning of the summer and the end of the summer, between before the experiment and after the experiment. And you can see that there's the biggest shift for the warming by drought experiment. At the end of the summer, these ionic exchange membranes are taking up much less nitrogen from the soil than they are in an ambient environment or a warmed environment or even the drought alone environment, right? So the warm by drought together having a big impact on nitrogen availability to the plants. And you can see that in the stoichiometry of the leaves of the plants. So this is the stoichiometry, the change in percent nitrogen for grasses. And you can see over the course of the summer, in the ambient treatment and the warm treatment, the amount of nitrogen in the leaves goes up because they're continually taking up nitrogen from the soil. But in the drought and the warm by drought treatment, you're seeing they basically stop taking up nitrogen because the way nitrogen gets taken up by the roots is through diffusion through water, right? So if there's no water in the soil, the plants can't extract the nitrogen from the soil. And it's not an effect on carbon, right? The carbon, the percent of carbon in these leaves didn't really change that much depending on what the treatment was. It was only the nitrogen really that changed. And so if you look at the carbon to nitrogen ratio, an indicator of plant quality, right? The carbon to nitrogen ratio in the ambient and the warm treatment go down because the amount of nitrogen is going up throughout the season, whereas you're actually seeing an increase in the carbon to nitrogen ratio because the amount of nitrogen is going down in these leaves, right? So in these two treatments, we're seeing a big decrease in plant quality if you measure plant quality based on the amount of nitrogen that's in the leaves. And here you're seeing an increase in plant quality. And that's what I think is accounting for what's going on with the grasshoppers, right? If the plants have less nitrogen in them and the grasshoppers need nitrogen to build their eggs, if there's not enough nitrogen in the plants, they're going to want to save that nitrogen that's within their eggs and resorb it back into their body. So, just to summarize here, right, warming by drought has the biggest negative effect on goldenrod and grasshopper fitness, but in the grasshopper case, it actually reversed the effects of warming by itself. And I think that the nutritional effects of climate change on plants may have played a role in this. right? People typically haven't thought about how the nutritional effects of climate change on a plant community could sort of cascade up through a food web. But the work that I'm doing now that's building on this is trying to sort of explore that in more detail. I didn't show this data, but the spiders were actually sensitive to any environmental change. Like it didn't matter if it was just warming, just drought, or just warming by drought. They did not like it. Their survival dropped off a cliff, basically. Their survival was cut in half by any change in the environment. And that just goes to show that different trophic levels respond very differently to the same treatments, right? And so the takeaway is that interactions between climate variables can be really important for understanding realistic species responses instead of just either one in isolation. So, second case study, modeling shifts in community size structure in multivariable climate change scenarios. This is using the same system as a base, but then building a model to try to predict what might happen in a realistic scenario. And this is based on, the work was motivated by this paper that came out in 2011, which proposed a third universal response to warming. So in the climate change literature, people have tried to come up with universal responses, sort of like laws of climate change. The first law of climate change is that, and again, it's not really a law, and it's not consistent across all species, but it's consistent across many, many species. The first one is that phenology changes. The second one is that ranges will shift based on climate change. And then they were proposing this third one, which is that communities should get smaller. So the body size of individuals in a community should get smaller over time as temperatures increase. And the thinking behind it is based on Bergmann's rule, right? Bergmann's rule saying that higher latitude, colder environments tend to have larger animals, whereas lower latitude equatorial environments tend to have smaller animals. And the thinking behind it is that if you have a low temperature, environment, you need a large body size to be able to thermoregulate properly. Whereas if you're in a very hot environment, if you need a small body size, you can basically get rid of excess heat more easily, right? So that's the kind of thinking behind it. And so what we want to do, we want to actually test this. Well, is that true, first of all? And second of all, if you think about climate change in the context of more than just warming, does that law, does that universal rule hold? So we constructed a model food web, again parameterized with the food web that the lab at Yale had been studying for about 20 years. And it involved our spider predator. It involved two competing herbivores, one that was large and one that was small, and it involved a shared plant resource. So both of these herbivores are competing directly for the resources, and they're also competing through apparent competition with the shared predator. And what we did is we exposed this model food web to simultaneous shifts, not just in temperature, but also water availability and carbon dioxide. And there are two key assumptions here. The two key assumptions are that increases in any of these variables is going to increase the growth rate of the plants. And if you, in general, this isn't, again, a universal thing, but in general, if a plant increases its growth rate, its quality tends to go down. It tends to have a lower concentration of nitrogen in its tissues, which means that it is less nutritious for the herbivores that are eating it. And then the second assumption is that the larger herbivores are able to handle low-quality nutrients better than the smaller herbivores. And this is, again, based on some experiments from the 80s that showed that if you have a lower ratio of intake rate of food to the size of your gut, then you're more able to deal with low-quality food. And this was in insects and also in mammals too, that this was demonstrated. So again, we were making that assumption as well. So we wanted to see who would win out. Would the small herbivores or the large herbivores win out if you combined multiple of these variables together? First, if you just look at the variables by themselves, this is animal biomass on the y-axis. Over here is plant biomass on the second y-axis. If you just vary temperature, just vary soil moisture content, or just vary carbon dioxide, you will see that there are points where the large herbivores dominate. So the dotted line is your small herbivore biomass, the dashed line is your large herbivore biomass. So there's a section of temperature where the large herbivores outcompete the smaller herbivores. There's also a larger section of soil moisture content where the large herbivores dominate. And then there's a section of the carbon dioxide spectrum where the large herbivores dominate. Right? So we're seeing, based on the assumptions of our model, that there actually is a point where there's sort of a skewed community that goes towards these larger animals. It's not favoring the smaller animals in every single instance. And then if you combine them in a multivariate way, where we have temperature on the y-axis, we have moisture content on the x-axis, and these are three different scenarios of carbon dioxide. The top one is 400 parts per million, so basically where we're at right now. The middle scenario is 550 parts per million, and then this is the highest carbon dioxide scenario, 700 parts per million. And each one, they basically do the same thing, where there is a section of this interaction space between the variables where the small herbivores dominate. This green, it represents a small herbivore-dominated system, but the blue represents a large herbivore-dominated system, right? So there is a section of all three of these scenarios where all three of the climate variables are interacting, where the large herbivores are favored, and they actually outcompete and drive to extinction the smaller herbivores. So basically what we're demonstrating is that making the assumption that sort of all of these communities are going to gradually shift towards smaller animals just based on energetic principles of how temperature affects metabolism and thermoregulation. If you take more into account involving, the nutritional aspects of the resources that these animals are feeding on, that rule might not hold, right? So, I already said this, of course, but only considering those direct physiological effects, it could lead to unrealistic assumptions about how the world's going to behave in the future. And what I'm arguing here for is that the predictive accuracy comes from considering both indirect and direct effects on the whole food webs at the same time. Just concentrating on one might lead you in the wrong direction. Lastly, we have our third case study. Alligators responding to sea level rise in the Everglades. This is actually, the oldest work I did. This stuff was more recent. And it's in a slightly different context. It's not in sort of a trophic dynamic predator-prey context. This is in a range shift context, how species are going to shift their distribution across the globe based on climate change variables. So, just to give you a little context for range shifts, historically, range shift predictions were made at the functional group or the species level, right? You look at an entire species. How is that species distributed across the landscape? What kind of environments does it inhabit right now? Then you tried to predict how those environments were going to look in the future, and would those species still be there? In general, we're calling this climate envelope modeling. And just as an example here, I'll show you for the American crocodile. Right? This is a map of the current distribution of the American crocodile. And so the assumption of these climate envelope models is that wherever crocodile exists today, is the type of environment that it is able to thrive in. And if those environments become more abundant across the landscape, then the American crocodile will be able to then inhabit those environments. So if you do a predictive map, the predictive map of the American crocodile distribution in 2060, based on global circulation models trying to predict how the climate's going to look, you see that the crocodile range expands very dramatically into some places that it should not go, right? I mean, this is predicting that there's going to be, I don't know what this is, like Nebraska? Like there's going to be American crocodiles in Nebraska, right? Now, the people who created this model, they know that this isn't, that it's kind of like a rough cut, right? I mean, there's obviously physical barriers to distribution here. There's, human-made barriers. This is not, they're not saying that American crocodiles are definitely going to be in Nebraska by 2060. They're saying this is kind of like a if there were no barriers, this is what could happen. But the point is that this climate envelope modeling framework has a lot of assumptions and a lot of errors in it, right? Basically, people are moving kind of away from the climate envelope model framework and modeling distribution shifts at the whole species level. They're actually moving towards looking at the population level, right? This is a paper from 2014 where they were looking at different populations of the same species. Do they all respond to climate change in the same way in terms of shifting their distribution? And of course they found no, they don't, right? Because different populations become locally adapted to their environment that they're in right now. And so there's a high probability that different populations will respond differently to future climate change scenarios. What I'm arguing for, though, based on the research I'm about to show you, is that that the population level might not even be good enough. We might need to get to an individual level to think about how species ranges are going to shift. So the context for this is alligators responding to sea level rise. The reason that alligators respond to sea level rise is because they lack the ability to tolerate high saltwater environments for a long time. They can inhabit those environments for short periods of time, but not like their cousins, the true crocodiles, is a saltwater crocodile from Australia. They can basically, an adult saltwater crocodile can basically live in the ocean indefinitely. And the reason is because they have salt glands on their tongues that they are able to ingest salt water, then extract the salt from that water, and then basically spit it out of their mouth. Whereas alligators do not have those salt glands, right? So alligators are sensitive to the salt water in a way that crocodiles are not. So you would expect that as sea levels rise, coastal populations of alligators would respond in some way. I did this work in the southwest coast of Florida, area called the Shark River, where basically most of the fresh water from the Everglades flows out in sort of an arc shape and into the Gulf of Mexico. And this is a prime place to do sea level rise research because if you haven't been paying attention, South Florida is going to be likely underwater if sea level rise continues at its current pace. This is a map showing what South Florida looks like in a 1 meter rise of sea level, and you can see the entirety of Everglades National Park would be at least partially inundated by seawater for part of the year, which would be a serious problem for, people who want to visit the park, but it would also be a serious problem for the alligators. And I wanted to investigate, well, what are they going to do if this happens? So instead of waiting for sea level rise to happen, we can do a natural experiment because in South Florida there's a wet season and a dry season, so there's natural variability and salinity in this system. So during the wet season, which is roughly July to December, there's about 80% of the rain in South Florida falls during the wet season. So we have a lot of fresh water coming into the system from the north. It flows in and it pushes the salt water and keeps it out towards the Gulf of Mexico. Whereas, of course, we have the exact opposite dynamic in the dry season, where freshwater inputs decline dramatically, and the saltwater is able to push very far up into the system, right? So there's alligators all throughout here. So I want to see if you look at their movement patterns, their feeding patterns, how do they change based on seasonal dynamics, and then what can that tell us about potential future sea level rise scenarios? So how do you do this work? I'm sure that if Abby's ever, talked about alligators to anybody, you all have a general idea. But we would go out at night, and we would find alligators, and we would catch them from a boat. They would thrash around in the water for a while and almost knock you over. You let them tire themselves out, and then you bring them alongside the boat, put another snare around their mouth. Brave individual, usually me, is to grab them before they're taped up. You tape up the mouth, bring them on board the boat, take all your measurements and everything, and then I would attach these transmitters. These are acoustic transmitters to the tail with wire and marine epoxy, and then you release the alligators back out into the wild. Those acoustic transmitters, they emit a random ping sequence, like they're acoustic transmitters. It's an acoustic underwater ultra high frequency ping, or just a high frequency ping. I can't remember. But so those pings then go out through the water in the underwater environment, and they're picked up by these underwater monitors that we have, and I have a video to illustrate the underwater monitors and how those work. So this is an alligator swimming through the Shark River. You can see the pings that are coming off of its tail, and it swims past this underwater monitor that we have placed there, and that underwater monitor is listening for those pings and tracking those individuals. So we have this, we're also doing shark research at the same time. So sharks and alligators going up and down the river, and the listening stations are hearing every ping that comes off, and then the time and the date where the alligators were at any given time. And because actually that's on the next slide here. Because of the positioning of the monitors, each of these black dots is one of the monitors. At one point we had like 48 monitors in the Everglades. It was crazy. But because of the positioning of the monitors, you could actually tell the direction that the animals were heading to, right? Because if they hit this monitor and then that monitor, they're heading upriver. And just to prove to you that there are big differences in salinity in this environment, the gray line here is salinity during the dry season, and the black line here is salinity during the wet season. And as you move in this direction, you're getting closer to the Gulf of Mexico, and in this direction is further away from the Gulf of Mexico. And so you can see during the dry season, at every single monitoring site where we were measuring salinity, except for the furthest away site, there are big differences in salinity. So it gets really salty in the dry season, and it's more fresh in the wet season. So what did we do? We tagged 52 alligators between 2007 and 2010, and I ended up using 23 of them to do the analyses. They were all males. And I used these because they produced at least 3 months of data. I was not discriminatory towards the females. It's just that in the Shark River, it's a relatively deep water environment, and it turns out that female alligators prefer shallow water environments. So there just weren't a lot of females to choose from in this environment. And what we found is pretty striking. This is not the acoustic data. 2 of the alligators we actually put GPS trackers on because we wanted to compare the GPS data with the acoustic data. But we put them on the exact 2 right gators, luckily enough, to show how variable their movement patterns are, right? So this is 2 months worth of movement patterns for 2 alligators. This alligator here in black, this alligator here in white. And there's like no difference between these alligators. These alligators were captured on the same night. They were tagged at the same time. They were both males. They're both adults. They're both approximately the same size. One was like, I don't know, 5 centimeters or 10 centimeters larger than the other, but it's not that big of a difference. And yet they did wildly different things for the next 2 months. This alligator moved a total of like 320 kilometers in a 58-day period. And was, this doesn't illustrate it here, but he was moving back and forth like all the time. He would move all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, he would move all the way back to the freshwater, he'd move all the way back, he just kept going back and forth. This individual, remember, caught on the same night, just in a different location, he moved a total of 1.8 kilometers over the entire 58-day period. So we have one individual moving 1.8 kilometers, another moving 325 kilometers. What the hell is going on? They're the same species. They fit the same demographic profile. Why are they moving so differently? And just to show you more data beyond 2 individuals, so I classified them into different movement types. Some of the individuals never entered the downstream zone. They never went into a salty environment. I called them either residents or upstream commuters because they would bounce between the brackish areas and the freshwater areas. And then there were the downstream commuters, the DCs. They were the ones who I was just describing. They would constantly go back and forth between the 2. And you can see they use the habitat very differently. In red, we have this is time spent per zone. We have the downstream zone, the mid-estuary zone, and the upstream zone. And the upstream obviously being full freshwater. And so the red is the downstream, and you can see for the DC that the downstream commuters in the wet season, they're occupying the downstream zone, this really salty environment, more than 60% of the time, and then they'll come back to the brackish area, the mid-estuary zone, to sort of recalibrate their water, their salt levels. And during the dry season, they decrease their use of the downstream zone, but they're still using it about 30% of the time, roughly. Whereas we have these individuals who are never going into the downstream zone. They're just saying, I don't want any part of that. So I think it's safe to say that there's going to be some differences in how these animals respond to sea level rise, right? Like, these guys clearly are, and by the way, the breakdown of this is about 1/3 of the population was downstream commuters, and about 2/3 of the population was this type of movement pattern, right? So this wasn't just a couple individuals who were doing this. And yeah, so I think what's going to happen is as sea levels continue to rise and this area starts to get saltier, these downstream commuters, they're going to continue using the downstream habitats. They might not use it as much, they might not go as far towards the Gulf of Mexico as they did before, but they're still going to be using this area because clearly they don't mind saltwater as much as other animals do, whereas these guys, if saltwater comes into their environment, they're probably going to hightail it out of there, right? They're going to try to go find more favorable freshwater environments. So it's not like the whole species or even the whole population is going to respond the same. Individuals are responding in different ways. And just to prove to you again, this is all 23 of those male alligators, just showing that there's a full spectrum of habitat use patterns, where we have these individuals on the right who are the ones who are using the downstream zones heavily, and then we have these individuals on the left who are moving the upstream freshwater zones more heavily, and these individuals in the middle who are only using the brackish zones, right? So there's a full, it's not like a bimodal distribution, there's a full continuum of how the animals are moving around and using the habitats. So the conclusions here are that for some species, range shifts might not be able to be predictable from even species or population level patterns. To get a realistic prediction, accurate prediction, you might have to have individual level understanding of what these animals are doing, which is daunting. So, to wrap up here, the real question is how realistic is realistic enough, right? I'm advocating for more realism in these studies, in climate change ecology in general, but let's not go crazy, right? Because as we already indicated, ecology, food webs, just in general, are amazingly complex, right? And then we have climate change is really complex. If you tried to do a study where you accounted for, all 6 of these variables and every species in here, it'd be impossible. You couldn't do it, right? So I'm not saying you need to just keep pushing towards more realism until, you have a $100 million project that takes, 50 years, right? Because that's ridiculous. What I am advocating for is just trying to think more deeply about what really matters to the specific system you're interested in if you are, studying climate change issues. So I'll give you an example. One of the things I'm going to be doing at UNF is I'm going to be trying to figure out how climate change is going to affect alligator sex ratios, right? Alligators are reptiles that have temperature-dependent sex determination, so I think it's, safe to assume that climate change is going to affect the sex ratios in some way. We don't know what it is. Most of the research so far in this space has been in sea turtles, and you might have seen it recently. A study came out that showed that a population, I forget the species, but there was a population, I think, in Central America. They looked at the nesting beach, and the nesting beach was 100% female, so it was a completely feminized population. And they accounted for this because of increasing, sand temperatures on those beaches. And the same thing could happen in alligators, but nobody's ever studied it. So I want to research the effects of climate change on these alligator sex ratios. And so what should I consider, right? I have this long list of things I need to consider, but we can knock a bunch of these out just based on natural history knowledge of how the internal temperature environment of the nest is determined, right? We know the temperature is going to affect it, and that's what people would probably gravitate towards, but you obviously need to also think about precipitation, right? Because if you have a lot of rain falling on a nest, it's going to lower the temperature of that nest cavity, theoretically. And so any changes in precipitation could counteract the effects of temperature, and maybe it's not a problem for alligators. But what if you have an area where there's going to be a drought, right? The drought could exacerbate the effects of the temperature, and you could get an even more extreme response of the sex ratios. So in this scenario, I'm not thinking about carbon dioxide, I'm not thinking about wind or ozone or UV, because the odds of any one of those 4 things affecting the internal, temperature of an alligator's nest is pretty low. I mean, it's possible that maybe wind could affect, but I mean, these are low to the ground, right? They're not high up in the air. I'm not counting it out, but at first cut, I don't think it's really important to think about. The 2 are temperature and precipitation, right? So I'm going to do an experiment this summer at UNF, where I'm going to be crossing these temperature and precipitation variables to figure out what's more important for determining what's going to happen to the sex ratios of this animal. And that's what I would, that's my advice to any of you who are, this is hitting home for you, is to just think more deeply about the direct and indirect effects of multiple variables on whatever species or system or food web, whatever that you're thinking about. What might you be missing that could change the outcomes of any responses that you think you might be seeing? That's the bottom line takeaway. And with that, happy to take any questions that you may have. Thanks for your attention. As Abby said, you can follow my stupid tweets on Twitter, or get in touch with me over email if you want more information about anything. Thanks.
Oh, you have a question.
Yes, sir.
Testosterone makes us do stupid things, and your study was on males gators exclusively. I was wondering what your thoughts were on how females might respond, and my thought being that perhaps they would be less tolerant to extreme salinity gradients that those wandering males might be more tolerant of.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. What we know about female movement patterns in relation to male movement patterns, as I said, females generally prefer shallower water habitats. They generally prefer the freshwater habitats, and they like to stay close to areas that are good nesting grounds. And so if, very salty water reached a nesting ground, I think they would get out of there, because the babies can't survive in high salinity environments. The babies need access to freshwater environments to survive and grow well. So I think the females would respond more strongly. I just didn't get a chance to test it because I caught 52 alligators, or 54 alligators, and only 8 of them were females, right? So there's just no sample size there, which is why we focused on the males. And I think the males are more, I didn't tell you why I think there was such a difference in movement patterns, and I don't think it's because of demographic variables. I mean, it might sound kind of silly. I think they have different personality types. I think that, humans, some of them are extroverts and some of them are introverts. Some like to go out and explore the world and see what's going on. Others like to stay home. And I think that's what's going on. I actually have a project running with a collaborator to try to figure out, because we have the blood samples from all these individuals, try to figure out if there a genetic component to these different movement types, right? Are all the individuals who are commuting, are they more closely related to each other? And all the individuals who aren't commuting are more closely related to each other? So maybe there's like some kind of genetic component to determining it, but if not, I think it's like some weird personality thing. Yeah.
Do you think the females might be more biologically limiting? Would you argue to focus modeling efforts on them, or would you make an argument to be males as well as females?
Well, the females are definitely more limiting in terms of reproductive success because it's a polygynous, mating system that they have, right? Like one male will dominate access to multiple females at a time. And the actual natural wild sex ratios of the alligators that in the studies I've seen is like about 70% female, 30% male. So you don't need a lot of males to have, a successful alligator population. But, obviously if the male population gets too low, then that's a big problem. And what I'm more concerned about for the modeling stuff and for the sex ratio stuff is at really high temperatures, you get female biased populations. So if the temperatures of these environments are going to get really hot during the summertime and spring when nesting is happening, then we could have, like we see in the sea turtles or some sea turtle populations, you could see feminization of the entire population. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question. Yes?
I'm curious about what happened to the poor spiders.
When they died?
No, just like about the data. So I think you had an interaction at the second trophic level, even though it kind of looked additive, but that happened. It took two stressors to lead to a significant difference.
Yeah.
Was there no interaction with the spiders?
There's no interaction with the spiders. Sorry, I have the graph in another talk and I just didn't. I should have had it at the end of this talk so I can show you. But basically 90% of spiders survive in ambient conditions. And then if you hit them with warming, or you hit them with drought, or you hit them with both warming and drought, the survivorship drops to between 40 and 50%. And some of that is probably behavioral. Like, as I said, we know that with increasing temperatures, they move lower in the canopy so they can try to avoid some of that heat. But then that takes them away from their prey source, because their prey source likes to live higher in the canopy. So maybe it's like starvation, but they're sit and wait predators. They don't have high metabolic rates, so they don't need to eat that often. In this case, I thought it was more, I think it's more dehydration, to be honest. Because if there's no water, if there's no soil moisture in the environment, I just don't think they can handle it very well.
Do you have any insight you'd like to hand wave about regarding how multiple stressors operate at different trophic levels? I'm curious about that. If you have any perspective from alligators and spiders, grasshoppers.
Yeah. What I can tell you is there's not a lot of research on that topic. What I can tell you is that what's the name of the guy? This guy at Brown University who does work on rocky intertidal communities of it's like mussels and like dog whelks or something. I can't remember. But he's done, what is his name?
Never mind.
No, but now...
We don't have to remember it.
That's
We'll
okay.
figure it out later.
Anyway, so if you look up, he's a professor at Brown University, and he's a big like wetlands guy, right? Like a big like salt marsh ecosystem guy. So he's done the studies looking at effects of like ocean temperature and I think ocean acidification on the various trophic levels in this predator-prey system. And what he found, if I'm remembering correctly, is that the higher trophic level you go, the larger the effect is.
Yes,
So there's something about predators where they're more sensitive to shifts in the environment than the herbivores or the plants are. And I'm not exactly sure why.
Well, you're poking at it a little bit when you're doing this factorial experiment. I don't know.
Yeah, I know, I'm poking at it, I just don't know the answer.
Yeah.
It's a great question. I mean, I'm going to keep looking at it. Yeah.
So a bit of a speculation and hand-waving question, I guess, for you. I mean, so assuming that there is some kind of genetic or component to the personality or movement variation, I guess given sea level rise, and just to speculate, would you expect to see that maintained or perhaps get reduced or, one tactic selected for or against? Like what?
I think it depends. I don't think it depends on the salinity. I think it depends, it depends a little bit on the salinity. I think it depends on what the food does.
Right.
Because I didn't say it, but the reason that the commuters, when we demonstrated this in the paper from 2011, the reason that the commuters commute is because there's more food available in the saltier environments, right? So it's a trade-off. The commuters are expending more energy to find food, but they're gaining access to more food. Whereas the stay-at-home gators aren't expending as much energy looking for food, but they have access to less food, right? So if the salinity rises in the coastal areas, if the prey that are adapted to a saltier environment move with that sort of advancing front, then the alligators that are commuting, I think, will keep commuting, right? But if only the saltwater is moving up and the prey are staying like still further out in whatever the new continental shelf will be, or these like, submerged Everglades environments, then I don't think that they would continue that behavior. I think it's the interaction between the salt water and the prey that makes the difference. Yeah?
What kind of migration range are you looking at with that figure that you showed earlier, going off that same question?
The migration range of the alligators?
Yeah, or not migration, but just the commuter range.
Yeah.
What distances traveled there?
Yeah, no, good question. So the distance from...
I can't see that legend from back here. So.
Oh yeah, no, I'll tell you. So the distance from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the most northern reaches of the study site, which were off the map over here, is about 30 kilometers. Okay. And what they would typically do, this guy obviously made a trip up into that area, but that was rare. Usually what they do is they would hang out in this area called Tarpon Bay for like a couple days, then they would zoom through this sort of river highway, they would come down here, they'd stay here for a couple days, then they'd go back up. And so this is about 15 kilometers. So they're basically making a 30-kilometer round trip. And it's frequent. Like this guy, he made this trip between here and here 50 times in like 5 months. So it's not a rare thing.
Diet's mostly fishes?
The diet here was actually mostly blue crabs.
Blue crabs?
Yeah.
So maybe it's tidal dependent to some degree?
It's definitely tidal dependent.
Maybe
I
based
shouldn't say
on
definitely
food
because I didn't
phase?
actually investigate it.
Yeah.
But in other species of crocodilians, they found that they will take advantage of tidal cycles to aid their movement patterns. And I didn't look at it in this system, but I would be shocked if they weren't trying to take advantage of the tides.
So those crabs, they'll move in between areas of mud and low level and along the salinity gradient as well.
Yeah. But what we were finding is, I would stomach pump these guys too to figure out what prey they were actually targeting. And the blue crabs were the dominant prey, but sometimes you would catch animals like in this area, and they would have a stomach that's full of like anchovies. They would come across some bait ball of 10,000 anchovies, and they would just gorge on it. And I had to count all those anchovies. It was terrible. And it smelled really bad. But so I think that they're coming down here to try to find these kind of aggregations of, larger aggregations of prey that might be available. Yes, sir.
Do you think the individual character will be passed down to the second generation?
The individual territories? Well, so first, the territoriality, we need Bradley Strickland here, right? Because he's like the territory guy. In this area, so this is not an area where the alligators are mating, right? The mating happens further up in the freshwater marshes. And from what I understand about alligator territoriality, that's really a mating season phenomenon. I don't think when it's not the mating season and they're just down here kind of moving around, I don't think they really have territories and that they're guarding them or anything. Because I thought about that, right? Maybe smaller individuals have to stay in the freshwater areas because the larger individuals are going down and they don't let the smaller individuals. But I don't think that's happening because there was no difference in the sizes of the individuals that were doing either tactic. But yeah, with the genetics, that's what I'm curious about, is the ability or the desire to be a downstream commuter, is that passed down from generation to generation? And I don't know the answer yet.
All right, well, just a quick announcement. We're going to go to the Estuary after this, so see you there. Adam has to take off around 8:30, his flight leaves at 8:30, so we won't be there all night. But hope you'll join us for a little bit. But anyway, let's thank him again.
But yeah, I think I'm gonna use she said that